Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are heading into day 92 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And as we continue to watch the conflict evolve and take shape, we can clearly see what the current Russian strategy is in this ongoing conflict. Obviously, in the initial stages of the conflict, it was designed to be a very rapid takedown of the Ukrainian state with the seizure of some very large, or the attempted seizure of very large cities, to include the capital, Kiev. However, since that did not work according to plan, the Russians now are utilizing a different strategy, and that is one to wear down and eventually look to destroy the Ukrainian military in its current form. It really seeks, meaning the Russian armed forces, seek to continue to degrade and destroy the ability of the Ukrainian state to provide weapons and equipment to some of these frontline, or most of these frontline units. If we look at the makeup of the Ukrainian armed forces, especially the types and amounts of heavy artillery and multiple launch rocket system, obviously it comes from either Soviet or Russian origin. Yes, the Ukrainians can manufacture many of these systems on their own, to include the ammunition. Now, however, with the current Russian strategy, that strategy is designed to destroy many of those weapons depots, and they're also designed to destroy and degrade the actual manufacturing components within the Ukrainian state to further provide these systems, be it ammunition or what have you, to the Ukrainian frontline forces. If we look at the Institute for Strategic Studies, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and we look at the makeup of, for instance, the Ukrainian artillery that it possessed in its armed forces prior to conflict. Now, look, this isn't exactly right, but this will give you a very, very rough idea of the kind of systems that the Ukrainians possessed. And again, they look a lot like what the Russian armed forces possessed as well. So, kind of looking at this, they had just under 2,000 artillery pieces. This specifically says 1,737, with 532 self-propelled 2S1s with that are 122 millimeter in caliber, 288 2S3s that are 152 millimeter in caliber. They also have an amount of the 2S19 and 2S7, and those are the larger 203 millimeter type of systems. In terms of towed artillery, they possess 515 122 millimeter and 440 152 millimeter towed systems, and then obviously a host of mortar systems ranging from very small caliber up to 120 millimeter. They also possessed 70 9P140 Uragan and 75 9A52 Smerch. And these are long-range guided, non-guided rocket systems that the Russians also possess themselves, and are also being widely used in this conflict. But the big issue for the Ukrainians is that a lot of this equipment is being destroyed, and the Russians are also reducing the Ukrainian ability to manufacture and or repair a lot of this equipment. They're going after the Ukrainian arms factories and the ability that would help the Ukrainians take equipment, refurbish it, and refield some of this equipment. And more importantly, for the Ukrainians, it's the fact that the Russians are destroying, with tactical air assets and cruise missiles, a lot of these weapons depots that is now making it very, very difficult for the Ukrainian forces to continue military operations, especially some of these large-scale artillery operations that we have seen occurring now for the last 30, 60, 90 days and continue as we speak. Now, that's not to say that the Ukrainians have lost all heavy artillery capability. That's simply not the case. But the Ukrainians right now are very aware that their stocks of ammunition for these systems, for these 122, for these 152 millimeter systems, and other systems as well, is rapidly being depleted by, one, the intensity of the conflict in the use of said ammunition. And then what makes it really difficult for the Ukrainians is a lot of these factories that were producing this ammunition for the Ukrainians or had the ability to produce either 152 or 122 millimeter rounds have been destroyed or knocked out of service by Russian cruise missile or air attacks. Furthermore, obviously, the Ukrainians, to an extent, are depending on Eastern European countries to provide some of these resources to the Ukrainian state. However, these systems and these shipments themselves are also being targeted by Russian forces as well. But more importantly, just kind of the tactical level intelligence on the ground indicates that the situation for the Ukrainian military is very, very dire in terms of the long-term projected outcome based on the expenditure of ammunition and the requirement that the Ukrainian military will continue to need to keep up the tempo of the type of operations that we are currently seeing. So at a certain point, the Ukrainians will be forced to throw rocks at Russian forces, and the Russians will not be throwing rocks back at the Ukrainians. Now, I understand that sounds ridiculous, but when you run out of ammunition, what else do you do if you are a heavy artillery battery? Well, you don't have much of a choice, and you can convert those individuals, those soldiers, to infantry, to line infantry, and they can run around with AK-47s and 74s and what have you, and act as maybe as an anti-tank weapons team with an RPG 7 or whatever systems the West donates to the Ukrainians. But in the end, you will start to see the Ukrainians unable to field a lot of these heavy artillery systems that they have been currently using. And using very effectively against Russian forces. Now, as I talked about in a previous video, that's not the same for Russian forces. The institutions of the training institutions and the manufacturing ability of the Russian military. Not only that, but the supply depots within the Russian Federation are still very well maintained. That are not actively being attacked like those inside of Ukraine. So it puts the Ukrainian military at an incredible disadvantage when they cannot attack the ammunition and fuel and munition depots of the Russian Federation, whereas the Russian Federation can target those facilities of the Ukrainian state. Big tactical mismatch there, for our strategic mismatch, I should say, for Ukrainian forces. Now, that's not to say that the West will not continue to supply some of these weapons, but they're not going to be supplied in an amount that may keep up with the pace of some of these military operations we're seeing. And we continue to see the Russians use a lot of heavy artillery and continue to pound away at Ukrainian forces in this ongoing conflict. Now, you could say, well, the Russians are using less precision-guided munitions and less cruise missiles and relying more on dumb systems. Well, I mean, that is going to happen, and as long as the Russians have those systems to deploy, they're going to use them. Meaning, some of those dumb systems. You got to remember that the Russian state for many decades was preparing for World War III and quite possibly a multi-front World War. So the Russians have plenty of supplies kept in reserve and in depots around the Russian Federation that can be pulled out and used at a certain period of time. And remember, those sites are not being targeted by the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian arms depots are being targeted by the Russian Federation. So again, you have to kind of take that into context and understand the mismatch that eventually, if you look another 90 days down the road, where the Ukrainians will be sitting in terms of their ability to supply their armies. I believe the Western media tends to kind of operate in a very, very near term, meaning they look at maybe a Russian tank column that was ambushed successfully by Ukrainian forces. And that becomes the total of the conflict. And you have to understand that's not the case. That yes, that was a battle or an engagement that was lost by the Russians and won by the Ukrainians. But in the end, you can win a fairly large amount of tactical engagements and still lose the war. Look at 1940s German invasion of Russia. A lot of initial engagements in which we thought that indeed the German army was going to defeat the Russian army, and we obviously know how that turned out. In other conflicts, the Spanish Civil War, again, the initial thought process around a Republican victory that many folks thought would happen eventually turned into something different, and obviously the Francoist Russian forces won that war. So you really have to look at what the media is saying, and then you have to look at history. And history and wars are not often won in set piece engagements in the near term. This is going to be, and the Russian strategy right now is clearly a long-term strategy to put the Ukrainians in a position where they are just completely worn out and really have exhausted all their ability to continue to prosecute a war. And then you could quite literally see things fall apart for the Ukrainian military very, very quickly. We're not there yet, and the Ukrainian military is performing very, very well, considering what they're up against. And I think most people did not see this going into the conflict, and it's taken people by quite a surprise. But at the same time, the Ukrainians are being supported heavily by Western nation states. Now, if the West is able to continue to maintain these supplies into Ukraine, which is also beginning to look a little suspect, the Russians are keying on the methods of supply into Ukraine and are targeting those methods deep inside of the Ukraine. And obviously, as those supplies are pushed forward towards the Russian border, the Russians are getting better at interdicting some of those systems and gaining and ascertaining intelligence on where some of these systems and where some of these ammunition deliveries are being delivered into the Ukraine. But is that to say that the Russian Federation is absolutely going to win this? No, you can't say that, because no one can really, at this point, can really say how this is going to end. There's a lot of moving pieces to this conflict, and right now, I would say that ultimately the victor it cannot be called at this moment. But the way the Russians are playing this, in the long-term goal in war strategy right now, is just designed to wear out the Ukrainian military until it can no longer function. And if the Russians are able to achieve that, and then launch some sort of major offensive, then the Ukrainians could be in a very, very dire situation, kind of in the near future. And at the same time, is it possible that we could see Russian forces start to fall apart because of significant casualties being taken? I think we've already seen that in some cases. However, the the Russians have been known for their fortitude, and you cannot discount their will to continue to prosecute the war. We've seen that in the past, and again, the West looks at the near term, whereas quite possibly at this point, maybe the Russians are planning for a 1 year, 2 year conflict. Very possible. You cannot rule that out. And in other conflicts, the Syrian civil war is a very good assessment of how the West misread the strategic and tactical situation on the ground. At one point, the West, especially the White House, the U.S. administration at the time, adamantly believed that the Assad regime was going to fall, and had mentioned that many times, that it was with absolute certainty that the Assad regime was going to fall. And the conflict continued. Obviously, there was Russian intervention, and that did not occur. So it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen and what things are going to look like 1 year from now. My concern is that there's a high probability this could escalate. Again, we're still early. We're 90 days into the conflict. Obviously, many wars, last for years. And who knows what's going to happen within the confines of this conflict? Very difficult to say. But anyway, right now, as we speak, the Russians continue offensive operations, the most successful offensive operations near Popasna. The Russians have, for all intents and purposes, severed the Bakhmut to Lysychansk main road. When Russian forces are this close, maybe they don't occupy the actual physical portions of the road, but when you're this close, very, very difficult to navigate and move forces from areas west of Bakhmut towards the front lines, towards Lysychansk, and the same to the north as well. From the area of Sloviansk over to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Same situation. The Russians have the ability to target now this main highway towards Lysychansk, so it's going to become more and more difficult for Ukrainian forces to supply its forces within Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and we continue to see the Russians pressing forward in an attempt to encircle with the idea to circle these Ukrainian forces and to eventually pocket the 17th Tank Brigade, 118th Territorial, 58th Brigade, and a hodgepodge of other units as well that are located in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk as well. But that continues to be the situation on the ground. We are seeing, as I talked about in previous episodes, the Russians are starting to maneuver better. That is in part that the ground is no longer muddy, and Russian forces can now move in some of these open fields and areas without the risk of simply getting stuck. And that is starting to change the dynamic of this conflict as Russian forces are starting to maneuver better and not simply maneuver along these main highways and roads, leaving themselves very, very open to these anti-tank weapons teams deployed by Ukrainian forces. So that is also going to be a part that comes into play in this conflict too. Again, the ability of Russian forces to circumnavigate areas of land where there are no roads or highways, and we'll continue to watch how that continues to play out. But with that being said, the Ukrainians still maintain very adequate defensive lines, areas outside of the Popasna area of operations. Sloviansk is very well enforced, Kramatorsk reinforced, Bakhmut reinforced, fairly stable lines to the northwest of Sloviansk and elsewhere. But right now, we're going to have to watch this very, very closely in terms of will ultimately the Russians gain victory and pocket those forces near Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And then also the big issue is the long-term ability of the Ukrainian military to supply its forces in the field. That is going to be called into question here within the next 30 to 60 days, where, again, it could become a very, very dire situation for Ukrainian forces. Thanks for joining us, and we'll have more very, very soon. Have a good day.